Welcome. Happy Monday, family, friends, cousins, neighbors, everybody. It's good to talk to you. I'm hoping everybody's Monday is going pretty good. You know, here in North Carolina, it's kind of thinking the first or second day of fall. It still feels like summer outside. But hey, we are here. Welcome to Roots and Branches podcast as we take a deep dive into our family history. I'm your host, Darryl Powell, Dr. Darryl Powell the son. Believe that. Don't forget that. I'm just joking. Y'all ain't gotta call me Dr. Powell. It just sounds good. Hey, we're back. And if you are back, thank you. Remember, you could be anywhere in the world, but you are here. And I appreciate that. I just wanted to start off today by just giving a few shout outs. Happy birthday. Happy belated birthday to my aunt Yvonne. I am sorry I could not make it to the party this weekend. I heard everybody was there and having a good time. So happy birthday. I'll reach out to you when I can. I'll probably see you soon. I talk to Princess all the time. And yeah, so I just wanted to send that shout out. Also, shout out to all the family members that have reached out and said they are enjoying the podcast. I am enjoying making it. Starting to feel like a job, but you know what? It's all good because I love y'all. And y'all love me too. Also, I just wanted to make note that, hey, listen, shout out to, and God rest her soul, Aunt Della Mae. I was talking to my mom about, you know, the podcast, and like I told you guys, the podcast, a lot of this information is really on the backs of my mom's initial genealogy research. And mom was letting me know, and for those who don't know, mom is Daphne Powell, aka DAP, the mouth of the South. Y'all know how I go. Mom was telling me that a lot of some of the early research with the Hinton family, specifically as it relates to them, was done by Aunt Della Mae, and she gave mom a really good head start. I think mom was telling me with some of her research and that she's done in some of the counties in Johnston County, she was able to go back and see a lot of the initial research that Aunt Della Mae did in those places. So shout out to Aunt Della Mae for being one of the pioneers to start this. So I want to just start out today by saying we're going to take a deep dive into the story of Grivel Hinton, who becomes one of the first black men ancestors that we find in our history. Before we dive straight into the life of Grivel, and that's Grivel, spelled Grivel. Before we jump into Grivel's life, I want to set the stage to, you know, kind of give some context to understand Grivel's story. We first need to kind of go back a little bit, and we need to revisit a few women that put these wheels in motion. So we're going to start with Esther Hinton. And Esther was a member of the Hinton family during a time where the institution of slavery was deeply embedded into the fabric of our society, specifically in places like Johnston County. Her daughter, Elizabeth Hinton Rand, inherited a lot of the land that that Esther had left after her and her husband's death. So the records that we have here specifically show that in a will, and I'm looking at it right now, and I'll probably share this so you guys can have the documentation as it relates to slavery and kind of where it starts with us in the Hinton family. In the will of Esther Hinton, she leaves Elizabeth Hinton Rand one individual slave. That slave was Grivel Hinton. In 1845, Esther passed away, and it became one of the things that, you know, put into motion this documentation showing that, hey, the Hinton family did own slaves. And in this specific case, they owned a slave by the name of Grivel. And Grivel was put in the will like property to be inherited by Esther. Esther transferred over the ownership of Grivel to her daughter Elizabeth, and this was not a unique act, right? This is how the institution of slavery persisted. Men would pass down slaves to their wives, and then wives would pass down slaves to their children, along with the along with the land and other heirlooms. This inheritance marked a defining moment in Grivel's life, because one of the things that becomes interesting is Grivel Hinton, in some capacity, it seems, was freed as a slave. Now, the interesting part about Grivel Hinton is born in 1820, and he gets sold to Elizabeth, or not gets sold, he gets inherited by Elizabeth Rand in 1845. Now, here's why that is important. Because if Grivel was inherited by Elizabeth Rand in 1845, this would definitely still make him an active slave. Slavery wasn't abolished until 1863. And fun fact, North Carolinians, although slavery was abolished in 1863, Johnston County, North Carolina did not recognize slavery's emancipation until 1865. So there were over 40,000 slaves in North Carolina in 1863, and they were not really freed until 1865. Needless to say, what becomes weird about Grivel's story is that although he was still probably 30 years old, probably 34 years old at the time that he was inherited by Elizabeth Hinton Rand, he seems to be a person who was freed, because by 1870, Grivel is reported as living in Clayton in Johnston County at the age of 50. And then by the 1880 census, Grivel is still living in Clayton Township in Johnston County at the age of 66. And, you know, he's married to a lady by the name of Frances Hinton. And she was born in 1845. What's weird is that in a lot of cases, we don't see clean documentation of slave records. There was only, I think, about 3 states in America that required for slave records to include names and ages of slaves. So in this specific instance, as a family, for anybody that's related to the Hintons in this regard that I'm speaking to, it's kind of a blessing here that we can actually see the name of our probably first African-American ancestor in Grivel Hinton. And we actually know the name of his wife. And I mean, he has 6 children. 6 children. By 1874, he has all 6 children. So this man goes from being a slave and born into slavery in 1820. He is then, he's in the Hinton. He's a slave of the Hintons, you know, being the property of Esther Hinton and her husband, and what I would imagine be the plantation that the Hintons owned, called Clay Hill on the Noose. I will talk a little bit more about the location of this plantation probably next week. I want to do a little bit more research before I start giving y'all information. But let's just put a marker in that. Clay Hill on the Noose, which is in Johnston County. It's been confirmed. I actually have a picture of the house, or the big house as they would call it. And yeah, so Grivel was definitely a slave. But by the time we get to 1870, you know, we're about 5 years removed from emancipation in North Carolina, 7 years removed from American emancipation, and he seems to have already established a pretty good footing in Clayton. I just want to take a time out here to let you know that just to debunk some, let's debunk some slave folklore about our family. So I don't know about the other parts of your family. You know, everybody has 4 parts specifically, right? You got your mom's side, you got your dad's side, and then on those 2 sides, you have sets of grandparents. So, you know, if some of this stuff isn't making sense as it relates to you completely, you know, this is just one sliver of your history. But here's a fun fact here. In the Hinton family stuff that we have, not saying it's the end all be all. If you find something different, let me know. We are not opposed to criticism here. But what we find is that there was no mixing here between whites and blacks. Typically what you can see is a lot of slaves were born from white slave masters that impregnated black women slaves. I would imagine 99% of the time it was by force and not by consent. Don't ever forget that part. But needless to say, that did not happen here. So, for instance, my wife's family, also from North Carolina in the Bahama area, her family is littered with blacks and whites that were mixing as mulattoes and having kids. But as it relates to the Hinton family in this tree, it's not any evidence that happened. We see here that Grivel Hinton arrives and he marries a black woman, and I believe in the census that shows Grivel Hinton, he is a black man. He is a man of color. He is not mulatto. He is not white. He is black. So by 1870, he's married, and he got married in 1845 at the age of 25 years old. And we have the name of his wife, Frances. That's incredibly rare in a lot of cases. So, needless to say, that another thing we want to debunk is we have this imagination as black people that slavery in our families is this idea that there was a big house and there was thousands of slaves that was owned, and one of those slaves was your ancestors. And a lot of times that did happen. The Hinton family, while prominent in Johnston County, was a moderate slave-owning family. They did have plenty of land that was given to them via land grants, and what that means is we took Indian land and we gave it to white people to cultivate. So in this case, Colonel Hinton, father of John Hinton, who we're referring to, and his wife and all that stuff, they inherited land that was given to their ancestors for absolutely for free. So just imagine that. Okay, so just close your eyes and imagine that you want to have a future with a house and equity and kids and farm and all that good stuff. But instead of working hard for it, you go to a state where the white people say, hey, we have stolen all this land from Indians and you can just have it. Now, I don't know about y'all. I own a home. I wish somebody would have gave me the home and that I can have all the equity that my home has. A lot of the initial wealth and prominence that we see in families like the Hinton family, or to include the Hinton family, typically derive from the aspect that these white people were given land and then used slavery as a means to cultivate it. And we are not unique to that story. Grivel Hinton's story, you know, although a little bit more clean in records, never forget, this person was still a slave. And the thing about the Hinton family plantation, or the Hinton plantation, we don't see that there is a large amount of slaves. Historically, North Carolina, like I said, by the end of slavery, had about 40,000 slaves. Johnston County is one of the more notable slave counties just because of its proximity to Raleigh and some of the more prominence of the county. Like, for instance, I think the biggest landowner in Johnston County was a state senator or either a state supreme judge with the name Johnston, I think, and he had upwards to, I think, 550 slaves. That is an egregious amount of slaves, and that is a uniquely large number of slaves. Most slave-owning white people during this time may have only had between 6 to 12 slaves. Remember, slaves here are physical property, so it is like owning a car. Although it is egregious, please remember that having slaves was actually pretty expensive. So if you have a large plantation with a lot of slaves, that means that the landowner probably had a lot of money. Although the Johnston County records don't explicitly show that the Hintons owned a number of slaves that would have made them really prominent economically when it comes to slavery, we do have proof that there was a plantation, and we have proof via a will that at least one slave was given to a person. Grivel Hinton goes on to marry Frances Hinton, like I said, in 1845, and they have 6 children. John Hinton, born in 1862. James Hinton, born in 1864. Alonza Hinton, born in 1866. William Hinton, born in 1868. Fanny Hinton, born in 1874. And Rufus Hinton, born in 1873. So I'm going to pause there for today's podcast. That's a lot of information, and that's a lot of information to have to comb through in the process. Because I know I got to give y'all room to process this. Because sometimes you might have a perception of where you from or whatever the case is, and then you like, man, when you really get the information and you really hear where you from, you kind of have to process it. So next week, what we'll do is we will continue the journey of Grivel Hinton. I will resurface back on you about the actual plantation of Grivel Hinton to give us more context of where he was from. But from Grivel Hinton and his children, we are emerging to a place where his son John Hinton, born in 1862 in Johnston County, becomes one of the fathers of one of my great-great-grandparents by the name of Inez Hinton. And we will continue that story next week on Roots and Branches podcast. Thank you for listening. And remember, you could be anywhere in the world, but you chose to listen to me. And if you feel like the podcast is a waste of time, hey, you're not hurting my feelings at all. I do this because I love y'all. Also, if you like the podcast, hit the like button on Facebook. Comment, ask questions, talk to me. I'm a friendly person. I love y'all. Until next week, peace.